It's great to be here, and I'm going to be on my home territory today, speaking about what we can do to prevent slip accidents. If anybody's wondering what on earth is Sliptember, it's basically something that I do every September where I really focus my time and effort on trying to raise awareness about slip safety throughout the month. Um, A, because Sliptember and September is a good play on words, but B, because actually September marks the kind of turning tide in terms of the weather. So actually, September is a good time to sort of refocus on this. Whereas, in many buildings over the summer months, the risk is a lot lower because there's a much lower chance of there being any liquid on floors. So if you'll permit me 2 minutes, I'm just going to give you a bit of background on me and why I am interested in safety. So if you cast your mind back to the summer or the spring of 2012, just before the London Olympics, when it feels like a lifetime ago because the country was all on the same page and everyone was happy and positive and all looking forward to that. I live in London, and this was a time before marriage and before kids. So Sundays were a day of actually relaxing, whereas nowadays they're running around and going to clubs and so on and so forth. My wife and I, or she was my girlfriend at the time, went to this place called Columbia Road Flower Market, which is in East London. And you can get flowers, and there are like food vans, and there's a nice canal to go for a walk, and so on and so forth. So we were having a jolly nice Sunday afternoon. We then started our drive home, and we decided we'd pop into Sainsbury's to pick up a few bits and bobs. And we went to the Sainsbury's near Islington, near Angel Tube in London. We parked up our car, turned onto Tolpuddle Street, and started walking down towards the entrance of the store. And I was walking pretty much where the bloke in the blue jumper is shown in this photograph. And that's the last thing I remember for several hours. What happened was a car sped around the corner. We think must have been accelerating through a red light, was going too fast, lost control, sort of swerved a bit, mounted the curb, and ran into me. And this was me later on that evening in hospital. You can tell it's from many years ago because my hair in that photograph is nice and dark, and my hair now is very much more grey. You can see a bandage on my shoulder. I broke my collarbone, I broke my wrist, I broke my ankle, neck damage, and various other things. So I always say I was unlucky that it happened, but lucky that it wasn't worse. But obviously, once something like that has happened to you, you do get very interested in safety. So that's my story. Just quickly, a bit of info on me. So as Mike mentioned, I host something which I call the Safety Roundtable every couple of weeks. I've got my podcast, I've got my LinkedIn newsletter, and those are very broad about all sorts of different topics around safety and risk management. But my real area of focus, and I'll explain why in a second, is on slip safety, so the prevention of slip and fall accidents. I've worked in some high-profile cases in this area. And as Mike said, I'm launching my book on this topic in a couple of weeks. I'll give you some information on how you can come along to the book launch a bit later on. The business is called Slip Safety Services. We've won some awards. We've got some great partnerships with the likes of AXA, some high-profile clients, and I do a number of these talks for IOSH and other events in the safety and risk world as well. We've helped several thousand client sites to reduce their slips over the last few years, and we have calculated we're saving about £10 million a year of claim costs, which is the equivalent of three of these lovely big mansions. I think that's your house, Mike, isn't it, from memory? So why slips? So I got run over. You can see how getting run over would make you interested in safety, but why not road safety? Well, I was a management consultant by training, so very much led by data and analysis, and I started looking into safety. And what I discovered was that road safety were doing pretty well, but there was this big, massive category called slips, trips, and falls, where not only were we doing pretty poorly overall because it was the biggest cause of accidents, injuries, and insurance claims. But it was a very, very flat picture as well. So that struck me as an area where, if I wanted to do something in safety, why not concentrate on this big, big area? So that's the first kind of reason that I gravitated towards slips. And I'll share a bit more data on this in a minute, but when you look at slips, trips, and falls as a single category, in most cases, it's kind of 80% or more of that bigger category is slips rather than trips. Um, so they cause a lot of harm, slips. So there's a few statistics here: broken bone every 3 minutes, biggest cause of A&E admissions, 1.5 million NHS bed days, large criminal fines. So Tesco was fined almost £750,000 in 2020 after someone slipped and broke their hip. So there's a big cost, there's a big impact, but they are preventable. So here are a few examples of clients that we've supported using some of the principles I'm going to speak to you about today and some of the outcomes that they've achieved. So across different sectors, even in areas that you would say are going to be wet all the time, like swimming pools and bathtubs, it's more than possible to achieve big, big reductions. By the way, if you do have any questions as we go, just fire them into the chat and then we'll pick them off. So the first thing I want to say, I mentioned about slips and trips being different in terms of their size. And it's important to understand that they're not the same thing. So a slip is different to a trip, and a fall is often caused by a slip or a trip, but sometimes you can fall in a different way as well. So we need to differentiate between the three things. Here's a bit of data from the insurance world, and this shows the proportion of claims that come through that are slips versus trips. So you can see in manufacturing, for example, trips is only 3% of claims and slips is 38% of claims. So slips is massively larger in that sector. It's bigger in retail, it's bigger in hospitality, it's bigger in most sectors, in fact. These were three common ones that I pulled out to illustrate the point. So slips is a bigger problem than trips, and it's also a more complex problem to solve. When we're dealing with trips, I recommend people use this framework, which is TRIP. I'm a big fan of acronyms, as you'll hear as we go along. So remember these four things, and you should be able to stop trips from happening. So T is for tidy, so that's all about housekeeping and removing kind of temporary trip hazards. Remember, a trip is caused by a low level obstruction. Sometimes those are temporary, in other words, something that hasn't been tidied away or something that's been discarded or whatever it might be. Sometimes those are more permanent, like a curb. So tidying focuses on the temporary hazards. R is route, so this is all about, where possible, creating defined walkways and making people walk in specific areas. And the benefit of that is that you can then concentrate on those areas. So if you had a factory with walkways and people only walked on the walkways and vehicles or everywhere else, you wouldn't need to worry about your trip risks everywhere else because people will only be on the walkways. I is identify. This is about raising awareness. So there's the level of raising awareness around, here are these four things to look at, but there's also getting people to be more aware, to spot these hazards and to try and do something about them. And then P is plan, and that's all about ensuring good design and maintenance. So in my experience, these four principles when it comes to trips are pretty much what you need. But as we'll see when we get onto slips, there's a bit more depth than that. One tip, and I'm going to try and give you a few tips today, is that you can use a pound coin to stop trips. So this is something that I've seen EHOs do in the past when assessing, is a trip hazard something that needs to be addressed or not. Get a pound coin or a trolley coin and lay it on its side. If, like on the above example, the pound coin is higher than the lip, then monitor it, but don't worry too much about it. If the pound coin is less than the size of the lip on the potential hazard, then that's something you should try and address. When you're walking, the clearance of your foot is very, very small as it swings across the floor. So even the smallest amount of a lip can cause a problem. But having a pound coin, which is something that you can easily get, is a good barometer for that. So what we've got from that is that trips are pretty simple. And one of my big bugbears is that when we bundle together slips and trips and falls, we talk about that whole category being simple. But hopefully, as you'll see, as we start to explore this, slips are not quite as simple. Slips are more scientific. There are three key areas where I see people struggling around slips. There's a lack of clarity about what to do, and we can overcome that by getting some measurements in place and measuring what really is going to make an impact. There are some perception issues, so people think that slips are simple, like I said, impossible to solve, low cost, insignificant. So we need to overcome that through working on awareness, culture, and getting buy-in from different people at different levels, and an insufficient focus. By that I mean that we've all got control measures in place. Nobody's doing nothing on this, but typically what I find is that the control measures are pretty superficial. So if we can give some real clarity on some key actions, that's a good way of overcoming this. So I talk about this idea of slipology, and my book is called Prevent Slip Accidents with Slipology. And it's a 5-step kind of method or model that we go through. So we start with assess, amend, advocate, assure, affirm. That's the kind of journey that the book speaks to. Obviously, I can't go through a whole book in 40 minutes. So today I'm just going to focus a bit on the bottom two parts. If you get the assessment bit wrong, then the rest of it isn't going to stand up very well. An amend is about the physical improvements you can make. So I'm going to give you some tips on things you can do today. So running through slipology is a concept that I call chimes, and these are the 6 key reasons that people actually slip. So as we go through that pyramid of slipology, assess, amend, etc., chimes is going to run through all of that. So we're going to be looking at what can we do under each of these 6 areas as we go through the process. So let me run through this with you, and hopefully this will give you something interesting to think about. So the first thing is contamination. A floor that's perfectly clean and perfectly dry isn't going to present a slip risk, but any degree of contamination on the floor, whether that's water, dust, semi-solids, anything really that can produce a barrier between the foot and the floor, is going to change the slip risk. So we need to know what contamination have we got, how often is it building up, where's it coming from, how much of it can we withstand, how can we improve our reduction of that contamination, etc., etc. H is heel. That's about footwear. So again, just like with a floor, which we'll talk about in a minute, not all floors are the same, and not all footwear is the same. So one of the challenges around footwear is that we speak of safety footwear, but safety footwear doesn't necessarily mean slip-resistant footwear. And slip-resistant footwear in a kitchen might not be slip-resistant footwear if you're a gardener on some grass. So there are lots of intricacies here. The other challenge with heel is obviously that members of the public are hard, if not impossible, to control. So we've only got a limited amount of control in this area. I is individual. This is the human factors. So age and gender play a role. If you're an 80-year-old woman, you're more likely to slip and fall than if you're a 20-year-old man, statistically. You're also more likely to get seriously hurt if you're older, clearly. The key things here are about behavior. So by that, we mean, if you are walking normally, then that's one thing. But if you're pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, carrying, rushing, if you're distracted, any of these behaviors are going to increase the likelihood of a slip occurring. So what can we do to understand those behaviors and manage those behaviors, maybe even manage out some of those behaviors if we can, to reduce the chances of somebody suffering from a slip. M is maintenance, and this splits into 3. Change of use, so if we reconfigure buildings. Wear and tear, things change over time, and cleaning. And I'll give you some more examples on cleaning a bit later on, but cleaning's a massive control. E is environment. So this means obviously the weather. So, Manchester versus Mauritius versus Madrid, different climates, different temperatures, different rainfalls, etc. All of this plays a role. But a lot of this is about the built environment too. So entrance matting, which we'll speak about, canopies, lighting, noise, steps and stairs, ramps and slopes, all of these things contribute to slip risk. And then S is the surface. So as I alluded to before, some floors are more slip resistant than others. If you're walking down the high street on a paving slab, it can be pouring with rain and you're not going to slip over. But if you swapped the polished marble from the five-star hotel foyer out onto the pavement, then you're probably going to slip over. So some floors are more slippery than others. But as we'll talk about, you can't tell just by looking at a floor whether it's slip resistant or not. So when I get called into companies and they're kind of in trouble mode and they've got a slip problem and we go through this model, what we tend to find is that they're perhaps looking at one or two of these areas. Conversely, when I go in, normally this is when I'm being more proactive and can we come and have a look and see, as opposed to somebody calling me in, because I tend to get called in when there's a problem, obviously. But where companies are doing pretty well and they're not really suffering, it's because they are working in all of these areas and they're taking this kind of holistic view. So we need to understand which of these are controllable and when, and if they're not controllable by us or if they're less controllable, put more emphasis onto the other chimes. But ideally, we'd be, doing a good job in all 6 of these areas. Across all sectors and all industries, this is the average performance on chimes. And I'll explain to you how I know that in a minute. But most organizations are doing pretty well with footwear under heel. They're doing pretty well with maintenance and environment. They have the most room to improve on surface, individual, and sometimes contamination as well. So if we came in and we found this picture in your organization, the first thing I'd be saying to you is, right, what can we do to improve those 2 sort of lagging or underperforming areas, shall we say, and get up to a kind of equilibrium? And then after that, I'd be saying, right, now what can we do to continuously improve and drive improvements across the piece? The reason we've got those scores is because we've got this tool, which is it's like an online quiz. It's a free online quiz in simple terms called the Slip Prevention Scorecard. And what you do is you spend about 3 minutes and you answer some questions, and it gives you a score for each of the chimes, as well as an overall score as well. So if you haven't done this before, I'd really encourage you to, I wouldn't normally say this to somebody when I'm doing a presentation, but if you open up a browser, go to scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk, you could give this a go over the next 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll talk you through the journey of somebody who's used this. But I find it really, when I get the best feedback from audiences of these types of presentations is when now they've understood the chimes principles. If they get their scores for chimes, it kind of illuminates the rest of everything in their mind. So do give that a go while I chat through this next slide. So this was just an example of an organization who may have even, I'm trying to think, but may have even come to one of these IOSH presentations I've done before and did the scorecard. But it's a manufacturing facility. And this is how they scored. So they were doing really well on environment and heel. They were doing pretty well on maintenance, but they weren't doing that well on contamination, individual, and surface. So this person, I won't name the company obviously because it's confidential, but they took the scorecard, and then once you've done the scorecard, there's an opportunity to book in a Zoom review of the scorecard. So you can go through either with me or one of my team what the results are and what they mean for you, and then we can speak about, okay, what could be the next steps off the back of that. So we did that meeting and we then arranged to go and actually visit site. So I sent one of my team in to visit the site. We did some slip testing, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. we did a nice review of chimes. And the idea there was to cross-reference their own scores on the self-assessment with what we found and just check that this picture was correct, A, and B, to look at then off the back of that, what could be done to mitigate the risk in those key areas. And they got a nice thorough report off the back of that with some recommendations. Fast forward a few months, and what outcomes did they achieve? So they improved their cleaning regime. So we worked through with them, the difference between cleaning for aesthetics and cleaning for safety. They introduced some matting in certain areas and some other contamination control measures to stop contamination spreading around too widely within the facility. They improved their training and their awareness. They changed some of the activities that staff were doing, thinking about the human factors, and the fact that if you're pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, you've got more risk. They managed to eliminate certain staff activities. We helped them with some anti-slip treatments of floors that were in foreseeably wet areas that were quite slippery. And actually, rather than replacing them, which would have been downtime and expensive, we treated them to make them safe. And then going forward, they put in place a nice new specification so that when they build new facilities or extend or refurbish and replace areas, they had the right spec going forward. So to try and eliminate through design. So that was the kind of journey that this client went on. So I mentioned slip testing. The whole idea around slipology is that we're introducing science and we're trying to therefore measure and quantify what we can. So slip testing is great because it measures not only the surface, but it also informs us by measuring contamination and maintenance. So if we slip test over time, we see the effects of cleaning, wear and tear. And if we slip test different areas, we can understand change of use. So this is a good starting point because it kind of gives us 50% of the chimes and gives us a number or some numbers to start working from. So if you're not familiar with this, the test that's used by the HSE and the courts here in the UK is called a pendulum test. I'll show you a video of it in a second. What it does, as you'll see, is it swings like a pendulum. And as it swings down, a rubber slider on a foot strikes the floor, and that mimics the heel strike as you're walking along. The output of this test is a number called a pendulum test value, or PTV. And the great thing about this test versus other types of tests that are used in Europe, for example, is that you can actually use this in situ. There's a test called a ramp test in Europe, and you have to have a sample of the floor taken to a laboratory to do that test, whereas this test can be done anywhere. So I'll show you a quick video. So this guy's going to spray the floor with water. He's then going to release the foot, and it's going to swing from right to left. And you'll see why it's called a pendulum as you see it swinging. The foot is going to swing down and strike the floor. And there's a gauge used to have a predetermined distance of that strike. Swings through to the left, and it pushes a pointer onto a gauge on the machine. I'll show it to you again. So hopefully you can see how this kind of is mimicking. If you imagine walking and your heel coming down, coming down, coming down, this is mimicking that physical interaction of your heel on the floor. So spray the floor, release the foot, swings through, and then it pushes the pointer onto the gauge. So that's kind of how the test works in simple terms. So I said that the output of the test is a number. So why would we do the testing? There's two key reasons. One is that we can use that number to reduce our risk by measuring it and therefore understanding it better. So this is HSE data on the likelihood of an accident taking place in terms of 1 in X correlated to the PTV score. So if you start on the right-hand side, PTV score of 36 is a 1 in a million accident risk exposure. Whereas if you go 2 to the left, a PTV of 24 is a 1 in 20 risk exposure. So by doing this testing, we take away some of the kind of guesswork and the assumption and we actually measure and quantify our risk, and we figure out, right, where are we plotted on this scale? And then obviously, if we're down in that red zone and we're in an area that is likely to get wet or otherwise contaminated, we can see what we can do to move to the right and to reduce that risk. So that's the first benefit of the testing. The second benefit is that it helps you to defend claims. So I mentioned I have a podcast. David Scott is a lawyer from a firm called IOSH. He defends insurance claims for a living for leisure and hospitality clients. And he and I were chatting on my podcast about somebody slipping around a swimming pool. And he said, that person would slip and they would feel entitled to make a claim. And he said, no, because the duty of care is not to prevent every accident, it's to do what's reasonable to meet the expected standards. And so if you've got compliant slip test data, even if someone slips, even if they legitimately hurt themselves, you should expect to defend that claim. So there often is an assumption that, if someone slips and hurts themselves, there's nothing you can do. But actually, the data from the slip testing can be incredibly helpful at helping to defend yourself. So there's a bit of an overview in terms of the processes and the methodologies and the principles that we work to, an idea around slip testing. I'm now going to go into some more practical tips for you. So the first thing is to treat your floors zonally. So one of my bugbears is if I speak to a multi-site operation and I ask to see what they've got around slips. Firstly, they give me something which talks about slips, trips, and falls in one document. But secondly, it tends to be a very generic piece of risk assessment. And actually, if you think about it logically, very few of the areas in your building or buildings are likely to get regularly wet or contaminated, maybe 5%. But because we know these areas will get wet or contaminated, they need to be safe when they're wet or contaminated. The typical thing of, well, we have spillage control and we try and keep our floors dry. That doesn't work in a swimming pool. That doesn't work in a washroom, in my experience. It doesn't work in a kitchen, etc. There are some areas that the floor is going to get wet or contaminated, and the HC expectation, in my experience of how they enforce and the law and the court's expectation in terms of how they prosecute, is that those areas should be safe when they're wet. In other words, they should exceed that 36 plus PTV. Whereas the rest of the floors, they're not foreseeably wet or contaminated. So we just need to focus on good spillage control and trying to keep them clean and dry. So we should have a more zonal, bespoke approach to the areas that are in that yellow section, and we should be doing more there, and we should be doing less in the blue areas. Second thing that I'd like to highlight is matting. So this photograph is taken in a busy train station in the Midlands. You may know where it is based on the distinctive floor. And you can see they've got probably 2.5 meters of matting there, but it's a wet day. And what can you see very clearly from the photograph? Even though they've got entrance matting, the floor beyond the matting, well beyond the matting, in fact, is wet. So one of the things people often think is, oh, it's okay, we've got entrance matting. But actually, if the matting isn't large enough and it isn't performing well enough, then it isn't going to be doing what you want it to do. HSE produced some guidance a few years ago, and it's in the table on the right, and they said for peak traffic per hour of 78 people, you should have 3 to 4 meters of built-in matting. Whereas if you've got high traffic of 800 people per hour, so think of a train station, a supermarket, a school, a hospital, a busy office building, you should have 8 to 10 meters of matting. Now, I don't know about you, but in my experience, most buildings have nowhere near 8 to 10 meters of matting, even very busy ones. So you can't rely on the matting if you haven't got enough matting. What I'd suggest is, like I've done here when I took this photo, stand inside on a wet day and just see if the floor is getting wet beyond the matting or not. If it is, then you know that actually you need to think about that floor and how slippery it is or isn't. Whereas if it's not, then actually you would say, well, that's in your blue area. It's not getting foreseeably wet, and therefore we don't need to worry so much. Cleaning, I talked about before. So this is a shopping centre in Manchester. If you walked into this location and you looked at the floor, you'd probably think it was pretty clean. It's got a bit of shine to it. It looks pretty consistent. I think most people would say, yeah, that's a pretty clean floor. It's not until you do a little test patch and you realise actually it's consistently dirty, not clean. Um, and cleanliness of a floor can have a massive difference to the slip resistance performance of the floor. And I'll give you some data on that a little bit later with a couple of examples. Signage. This is CCTV footage from 2015, and it shows, as you can see, a yellow sign next to a puddle in an aisle of a co-op store in Truro in Cornwall. And you can see a pair of legs at the top of the screen. And tragically, those legs belong to a man called Stanley May, who was about to walk down the aisle, slip in the water, bang his head, and 48 hours later pass away. Co-op were prosecuted by Cornwall Council. £400,000 was the fine that they received. And Cornwall Council said this in their summing up: signage alone is not an adequate control. Proactive measures must be taken to either prevent floors becoming slippery or precluding public access. So the challenge with signs is most people think as long as we put a sign out, we're okay. The sign is clearly visible here, but it didn't stop the slip. It didn't stop him banging his head. It didn't stop him passing away, and it didn't stop the financial and reputational repercussions of that. So people get signage wrong. If you're using signs, it's a symptom that you've got a problem. There are only two times you should ever use a wet floor sign. One is when you are cleaning your floors proactively. So, we clean our floors between 6 and 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So we put the sign out while we're cleaning because we're knowingly introducing risk and making a floor potentially slippery. So absolutely, we should put the sign out then. The other time is when you're dealing with a temporary and unexpected spillage. And then you should absolutely put a sign out for maybe 5 minutes while you clean that spillage up, dry the floor off, and then the sign should be removed. If you're having to put signs out in any other scenario than those, then that's a symptom that you've got a problem. And the sign may well stop somebody from slipping, but it isn't going to protect you in the event of somebody getting actually hurt and a claim happening. And fifth is this thing around, I mentioned it earlier, about floors that kind of look safe versus are they actually safe? So these are 3 photographs that I took. This is a ramp in a hospital. It's used to push food trolleys up and down these couple of steps. This was relatively new, and it was kind of chosen because of how it looked, and it looked like it should be anti-slip, but they were finding it quite slippery. Actually, this checker plating, sometimes it can be anti-slip or slip resistant. Other times it can be very, very slippery, and you just can't tell by looking at it. This middle example is from a spice blending facility in the northeast. And I walked in here and I thought, oh, that's good. They've got a good floor. They've given themselves half a chance. And then we did a bit of slip testing. And what we found here was this is quite an old floor. I think it was down for 15 years. If you moved that racking on the left-hand side, or if you went close to the skirting boards anywhere and you felt the floor, it was as rough as sandpaper. But in the middle of the floor, the main walkways, it had worn smooth through usage over the years, and it was smooth. And so whether it was wet, which actually isn't a problem there, because in a spice blending facility, you don't want liquids there. But whether it was wet or whether it was contaminated with powder, which is obviously what the contaminants would be, it was very, very slippery. But the floor looked anti-slip. So the perception was it was safe. And that's quite dangerous when that happens, because we don't think about walking consciously. We just walk, and we are looking out for potential hazards subconsciously. But if we think a floor looks like it should be safe, then our brain switches off, and that's when accidents can happen. And then here's an example of a floor that looks anti-slip, but it's contaminated. So this was a leisure centre, and the general manager said, "Oh, we're fine. We haven't got a problem with slips because we've got this great anti-slip floor." And when that floor is clean, it does achieve a low slip potential. On the pendulum test, the PTV was over 40 when it was wet on that floor, but before it was cleaned, the PTV was well under 30 due to the contamination. So even and I've been spending the last 13 years looking at floors. I can't, I probably have as good a chance as anybody of looking at a floor and figuring out if it's going to be safe or not from a slip resistance perspective. But even I can't get it right all the time. So you can only know if you've got the data. So starting to draw things to a close, and then we can take some questions. What's in it for you? Why should you care? Why should we be focusing on slips? Why am I doing this talk? Why am I doing this? Why have I written a book on this? Why am I doing this Sliptember campaign? Talking all about slip prevention in September. If you take some steps to work on this risk, you're going to get some very quick wins. So you can have certainty because you can measure this stuff. That you've really made an impact, and it's not guesswork. It's not we're going to try and improve the safety culture. This is we're going to physically make our building safer. So straight away you will actually know and have that confidence and certainty that you've done something that will make a difference. And in the long run, what do? You get less harms, you get fewer people getting hurt, you get more time, because think about all those forms you have to fill in, all those accidents you have to investigate, etc. And you obviously get lower costs, and that means reinvestment into other areas of safety. So to recap, then, hopefully you've understood the themes here. Slips are serious, they're scientific, but they absolutely are stoppable. And here again are a few examples from different sectors. I include the one about eliminating accidents, not because I ever promise that to anybody, but just to show that it is possible to even do that. But I always say to people, at least a halving of accidents is something that we should be able to aim for. So next steps, and then I'm happy to take some questions. If we're not connected on LinkedIn, then do find me on LinkedIn and give me a follow. Posting all the time about safety and risk stuff, and this month obviously a lot about slip safety. If you'd like to delve into this even more, and you'd like to read thousands and thousands of words about this subject and cover it in much more depth, then I'd love for you to join me on the 18th at 12:30, where I'll be doing the launch of the book, the Prevent Slip Accidents with Slipology book. I'm sure we'll send the link out, but you can sign up for that at safetyroundtable.co.uk. And the book is going to be out on that day in Kindle for 99p, so you can get it very, very cheaply. The actual physical book will be coming out probably in October, because we need to take a bit of time to get these things printed. So summing up, hopefully that's been useful and beneficial, and opened your eyes as to some of the different ways that we can look at this topic. But if you thought this was all about slip testing, binning yellow signs, not wearing high heels, etc., then you've missed the point, or I've not explained it well enough. What I'm known for, and hopefully you've got this from today, is trying to bring a fresh and a scientific approach to an age-old problem, and one that's evidence-based and is proven to work. And hopefully after sort of experiencing this presentation, what I'd love for you to feel is that actually you can be confident about getting this risk under control. You can have certainty about getting this risk under control if you take this scientific approach. So that's it from me, guys. Thank you very much. I've run
Thank you, Christian.
bang on time.
Before you stop sharing, Did have a
Yeah,
request in the chat if you could show the slide with the pound coin again, please.
yeah, of course. Give me a second. Let me go through all of this first. There.
Yeah.
So one project that we've done this year in the last 12 months is we're working with an organisation called NHS Property Services, and they manage about 4,000, I think, NHS facilities, ranging from big acute hospitals all the way through to GP surgeries and everything in between. And we've done a lot of training and engagement and stuff and videos with them. But one of the things they did was that they bought, I think, about 2,000 trolley coins, which are the same size as a pound coin, and they branded them as on one side with their own brand, and then on the other side, they put, I can't remember what they said now, but they put a message on there about using this to assess trip risks. So they encouraged their facility staff, safety staff, cleaning staff to have one of these trolley coins available. And then when they spot a potential trip hazard, use this. And then if it is higher than that, take some action and try and address it. Really proud of that because that's, if you think about NHS facilities, you're thinking about, among the most vulnerable people around, and that's already having quite a big impact at, stopping people from getting re-hurt at a hospital or even getting hurt in the first place when they're there to visit somebody that they love.
Okay. The person asked, was there an animation or something else on that particular slide, Christian? He said he.
No, there wasn't. There was nothing on that. No, it was just to show that the difference between that if it's below that lip, then don't worry too much about it, or well, monitor it. But if it's above, then do something about it.
Great. A further question from the chat here. What do you think about anti-slip resin for floorings?
It can be great, and it can be a problem in that I've seen lots of applications where it's been done incorrectly, and the aggregate that should be there to give it slip resistance is not there. Perhaps it's sunk in below the surface, or it's been scattered too thinly, or whatever it might be. So uh, my team, my operations team that go and do the kind of solutions side of the physical solution side of what we do, we use products like that, but it has to be applied correctly. So with any floor, whether it's a resin or a tile or a lino or a whatever, I always recommend people to obviously get the specification right from a slip perspective, but also just to check that the floor that's being handed over to you performs as it's supposed to.
I think one of the things that came out of the round table this week with your guest on there, which really affected me when he said that, 80% of all the slip accidents are not recorded. Very often people have a slip, you get up, or I'm not really hurt. And
Yeah.
still 33% of the accidents are related to slip. But so many, that's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah. I mean, I've never slipped and fallen over, but I've slipped a lot of times in train stations and shops and pubs and all sorts of places. I've never reported one of those near misses because obviously, like, you know, they might think it's a bit sort of uh, self facing or I don't know what, but so I've always felt like no, I'm not gonna say anything because of who I am and what I do. Um, but yeah, I mean it's true that there are huge amounts of near misses in this field that are just not reported or not understood. And that could be because people are a bit sheepish or embarrassed, or it could be because people don't really know what they're looking for to spot them. There's lots and lots of reasons, but you're right that you know the Heinrich triangle I know comes in for a bit of skepticism. I looked at that in a chapter of my book actually with a HSE study that was done at the National Gallery, and the ratios, interestingly, there were between serious and sort of minor injuries were actually bang on what Heinrich said. Interestingly, but they weren't recording the near misses anywhere near. So HSE recorded the entrances using video cameras for 12 hours, and they recorded a phenomenal amount of near misses, but there were no near misses recorded at all in the accident log.
Got another question in the chat here saying, with this work you're doing on slips and trips, uh, can you tell us a bit about how this is applicable to a construction site where obviously things are quite dynamic and they're changing regularly, different
Yeah.
surface, different levels?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the most difficult types of sites to try and get a handle on this because, as you say, it's so dynamic and things are changing all the time. Um, what I would say there is to focus in on the bits that maybe aren't changing as much. So, the welfare areas, and places, the restaurants and places like that. In my experience, um, in different sectors, but also in construction, particularly when people are doing hazardous jobs, um, the vast majority of people take a lot of care and attention about safety when they're doing their job. And then something happens where they go for their tea break, or they go to the loo, or they go to get changed, and they sort of switch their brain off. And often things happen in these kind of less high risk areas. So I'd concentrate on the bits that you can manage, and then I would work from the perspective of the human factors, thinking about like what you can do around some of those different movements I mentioned, some of the things around awareness. And I also find what works well is trying to engage people on keeping their colleagues and friends safe rather than keeping themselves safe, because people seem to think that they're bulletproof, and they seem to think that this won't happen to me, particularly if you've worked somewhere for a long time. I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never, whatever. Um, you know, if you drove in a car with no seatbelt for 20 years, that doesn't mean that that's a good idea just because you haven't happened to have an accident. Um, Whereas if you can focus in on, your actions, Dave can help Tony or Peter or whoever, or Annie, Annabelle, or whoever it is, stay safe. That seems to work and resonate more with people. So a few ideas there, hopefully.
Yeah, a further question from the chat. What recommendations or what advice would you give to people when they're looking at staircases, particularly in an industrial setting?
So I did a post on LinkedIn actually today about a staircase incident where somebody lost a finger, which was quite nasty. Um, Stairs are primarily driven, or accidents on stairs are primarily driven by poor design. But by that I mean, um, sorry for the really budget um, thing here. So if you've got the going, which is the flat bit, and you've got the rise, which is the vertical, what you should have across your staircase is a consistency. So every going should be the same, and every rise should be the same. And that means that when you are walking, because as I said earlier, you don't pay attention when you walk. So if you're going up or downstairs, you plant your foot on the first step, and then subconsciously your brain calculates, right, every step is going to be in the same place. So most issues on stairs are where there's an inconsistency in dimension. So you're planting your foot somewhere where you're expecting the stair to be, and it isn't there. And then that's when people can fall. So I would recommend looking at that. A quick way of doing it is if you stand at the top of a flight of stairs and you crouch down, if you keep crouching down and looking, what you should see is that all of the nosings kind of blend into one sinuous line. And then sometimes what you find is one nosing disappears more quickly or sticks out a bit. And that's when you know there's an inconsistency. So get the consistency right, have good materials in place, have your handrails, have good lighting. Obviously, cleaning, maintenance, etc., is important as well. But the consistency is the biggest thing. The incident I mentioned that I posted about today, I didn't see it in real life. I saw the CCTV, but this guy, it was a set of stairs that were turning around a corner, um, and there was a bit of inconsistency in the dimensions, and also the handrail was too high, so he missed his step. And when you watch the video, it kind of looks a bit comical for about 3 seconds because he kind of goes around the corner, misses his step, and falls on his bum, and you think, oh, that's a bit funny, and then he looks at his hand and he screams because he's put his hand out to try and stop his fall, and it's like a lattice kind of balustrade, and his fingers got caught, and it's ripped his finger off from the knuckle, um, and that was, in part due to the inconsistency of dimensions.
Yeah,
That's a nice fun Friday thought, isn't it?
nice find Friday thought, and thank you very, very much, Christian. I think in the intro I didn't thank Paul, who's our representative from IOSH, who looks after Manchester in the Northwest. So I did miss him. I apologize for that, Paul. But thanks very much for your support on this one. I think East Lancashire have got a full series of events planned for next year for 2025. So please keep your eyes open, and we'd love to see you either online or in person at one of them. And once again, thank you very, very much, Christian, for your time and for a really insightful presentation. I enjoy it, and thank you, guys.
Pleasure. Thanks, everybody.